Good afternoon, and let me welcome all of you to this very special talk that we are having with a very distinguished scientist who heads our premier institution, the Institute of Science in Bangalore. It has a very, very high reputation, not only in India but in abroad as well. And I have had the occasion of meeting Professor Balaram when I was privileged to be invited to speak at the Institute of Science during my days doing climate change. And it was a great privilege to have that opportunity to interact with some of the best minds in our country. We are also very privileged to have our own life trustee, Dr. Shailesh Nayak, who used to be Secretary of the Ministry of Earth Sciences. But more than that, he's also a very distinguished scientist, and currently he heads the National Institute for Advanced Sciences in Bangalore. So both are very distinguished guests. Most warm welcome to all of you. Let me just say that you know, this year's festival, as you would have seen, is called Kalpaviksha. It is called Kalpaviksha because our effort was to try and see whether we could locate, that broader history of not just political awareness, political resurgence in India, but also look at how it was very much connected with many other aspects of national life, culture, art. We have seen some of the events that we have had here, where we have tried to focus attention on how pre-47 there was such a great deal of intellectual ferment taking place in this country, which includes, the ferment, intellectual ferment, which we see in science and technology as well. Maybe not many people think about that as one aspect of the national movement, but that was a very important component of the national movement, just as culture and art was. So we saw, for example, the role played by an institution like Shantiniketan, or the Bhandarkar Research Institute, whose exhibition we have in the committee room 1 in the IIC, where we are brought face to face with the tremendous amount of intellectual work that was carried out by very ordinary Indians. You know, um, really looking at almost like a sponge, absorbing knowledge from wherever they could get it. And that aspect of the national movement is perhaps something that we have not really focused attention on. So, what we invited Dr. Balaram to do was to really look at how, during this particular period, from this period he has chosen is 1927 to 1967. Uh, how was modern science in India, which we are very proud of, by the way, and we have great achievements, whether it is in atomic energy, whether it is in space sciences, but we should not de-link that from actually this history of the science and technology in the pre 1947 period as well. Some great names like J.C. Bose, C.V. Raman, and there were many others who were pioneers in terms of uh, not only the what Nehru used to call the scientific temper, bringing that scientific temper, the rationalist outlook. This particular period was very, very important for that. So I'm particularly grateful to Dr. Barnam to have found time to be with us and to share his thoughts with us on this particular aspect, the nationalist movement, the creation of the nationalist identity, and where the science and technology aspect plays into that. So with those initial remarks and welcome remarks, let me hand over the chair to my great friend, Dr. Shailesh Nayak, who will be chairing the session. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, sir. Very happy to also welcome Professor Balaram, who has been a great friend for last several years. Dr. Balaram, apart from he headed the Indian Institute of Science for a very long time, almost 9 to 10 years. Primarily, he is a scientist par excellence, and his contribution in molecular biophysics and the chemical biology is outstanding. He did his BSc in Pune, then MS in IIT Kanpur, then PhD in chemistry from Carnegie Mellon University. He was also associated with Harvard University. And currently he is chairing the National Center for Biological Sciences in Bangalore. I have seen him for last several years, and mainly wherever he goes, the things take dramatic change. And one example is the current science, where he completely changed the entire uh, structure of the current science, and it became really very popular magazine. Also, the number of issues are coming, the kind of articles, and these editorials during those times are still people keep it and read for time to time. Because of his contribution, Government of India has awarded him Padma Shri in 2002, Padma Bhushan in 2014, and one of very prestigious award by American Peptide Society, our Bruce Metrifield Award in 2021. So we are really very happy and honored to have you here, Professor Balaram, and the floor is yours to deliver your talk.
Good evening. I must begin with an apology. I'm not used to sitting down and talking. I've been a professor for much of my life, and professors usually stand at a podium and look down at the students and tell them what they should be learning. But uh, I'll try my best because I think the very configuration of the room itself, where some of my audience are sitting by my side and I can't see their faces, uh, is inhibiting in some way. But the reason I'm here is that I got a telephone call from Dr. Shailesh Nayak, and whenever he's asked me to go to his institution to give a talk, uh, I've done so. And so once again, when he asked me, I said, yes, of course I'll do it. It was only then I realized that I was supposed to give a talk on a subject in which I'm certainly not an expert. It's a subject on which many different people will have many different opinions. And I was born after independence, although I'm very old. And so I don't have any first hand knowledge of the nationalist movement. I was also inhibited today by the fact that I went to your library in the morning and I was there for 2 hours and I found many books that I ought to have read, but I haven't read because I've never seen them. Given these circumstances, I chose a topic because what I was told was that the Festival of Arts was now going to concentrate on the nationalist movement and the creation of a new nationalist identity, and to speak at this festival on the history of science, especially at its development and growth during the nationalist period and post independence. So, my presentation may be somewhat idiosyncratic in its organization, but you will forgive me. I chose as my topic, and then I realized when I was preparing the slides that maybe I had bitten off far more than I can chew on the shaping of modern Indian science in the decades 1927 to 67. This is the period before independence, and this is the period immediately after independence. And I chose 1967 so that I could leave out anything that was there in living memory. So many of it's always good to speak of those who have gone rather than to speak of those who are still around. So you may not find some names mentioned here who are in fact contributed enormously to post-independence science in India. There are 5 institutions which are pictured on the corners of this slide. They're the 3 universities which were set up in India, 1857, the most important date, and at Calcutta, Bombay, Madras. All 3 cities have now changed their names, so things have moved a great distance from there. At the bottom, there are the 2 institutions which were called research institutions. And those research institutions, curiously enough, were both set up at the initiative of Indians. And I will show you a little bit about these institutions because much of the science before independence and after independence was done either in the universities or in these research institutions. But before that, I realized that there aren't too many scientists in this audience. So if one asks the question, did the nationalist movement in the decades before and after independence influence the growth of science in India? The answer is yes, of course, because science is not any different from any other human activity, and it will definitely be influenced by all the developments that happen around you in the country. You might ask the question, what is science? And this often happens when you lecture to children. They'll ask you very difficult questions to which you have no answer. So my stock answer would be science is the study of nature. But children are usually undeterred. They immediately ask you the next question, what is nature? And so I spent some time some years ago looking for a definition of nature. Where does one go to look for a definition of nature? The most important journal in science, the one in which all scientists aspire to publish, is the journal Nature. It started off in England in 1869 and today is probably one of the most influential journals of science. In 1869, in its very first issue, there was an editorial because it's a new journal just starting out, and Nature's editors then commissioned the biologist Thomas Huxley to write the editorial. But Huxley did not write the editorial. What he did instead was to translate from the German an essay written by the German poet von Goethe in the previous century, in the 18th century. And what Goethe said was this. He said, nature, we are surrounded and embraced by her, powerless to separate ourselves from her, and powerless to penetrate beyond her. This means that almost anything that you study is then, even if you study human beings, you are actually a scientist and you're studying science. What happened now? Where did I press something wrong? Forward. Thank you. This one. Yeah, thank you. Let's look at the birth of institutions. Before science develops, there must be institutions. And in 1876, Mahendralal Sarkar in Calcutta and the Belgian priest Father Lafont started what was called the Indian Association for the Cultivation of Science. It was a building, and you see that building there in Beaubazar Street. It was a building which then for a very long time has been abandoned. Sarkar in 1900 said that the world's chief and greatest discoveries have been made by those who had or have to teach. Educational institutions still furnish the best laboratories for research. Pure research institutions have only recently come into existence. But Sarkar set up this institution, and it is this institution that the young C.V. Raman saw one day when he was going on to his government job. And when he saw the name Indian Association for the Cultivation of Science, he decided to explore what could be done there. And then he eventually began his researches at the Indian Association for the Cultivation of Science. That, of course, all of you know now is the stuff of legend. He discovered the Raman effect and eventually won the Nobel Prize. But if you want to look at the way institutions have grown in India, there's an outstanding description of this in this book written by a very scholarly professor at the University of Delhi on the history of India's education. Aparna Basu, who wrote this book, lists a long time ago, and you can see from the book itself, the book is frayed, the book is underlined, and I managed to get a copy from the Delhi University and make the slide. Now, it turns out she quotes Macaulay's minutes of 1835. Macaulay has now become infamous in India, and largely because of what he wrote and the language in which he wrote it. And you can see that he unhesitatingly decided in favor of English at that time. So, in many ways, all of those, most of us who speak English, now could be viewed as Macaulay's children. But then language is something that you use to communicate, so it doesn't really matter as long as you're able to communicate. The three universities were there for a very long time with nothing being added, but there was no research being done in them. It's the Indian Association for the Cultivation of Science, which was the first research institution in India, in Calcutta, followed by the universities which came up at Punjab, Allahabad. You can see that in between, the Indian Institute of Science was created in Bangalore, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. But the three men who are featured on this slide are those, I think, who have really contributed maximally to the transformation of India. This is because they set up educational institutions and research institutions, and it takes a very long time for the effects of research and education to percolate generally into society. Mahendralal Sarkar, Jamshedji Tata, on whom I will spend a little time, and Madan Mohan Malaviya, and Banaras Hindu University. Since I am in Delhi, I must tell you that the University of Delhi came much later, only in 1922, and the University of Delhi did not do too well at the beginning until it got a visionary vice chancellor in Maurice Guire about a couple of decades later. But all of this can be traced even further back to the roots of the Bengal Renaissance. Now, of course, there are many scholars who have studied the Bengal Renaissance. You can see that Raja Ram Mohan Roy and a whole group of other intellectuals in Kolkata and in the neighborhood set up in 1817 the Hindu College. The Hindu College was the first one which was to then push English education. And people began to learn English. This morphed into Presidency College in 1855. And over 1.5 centuries later, it's been transformed into Presidency University. But Presidency College is where much of the wonderful things that happened in Calcutta happened in the early years of the 20th century. I show you this because we've had this outpouring of emotion now when Mr. Ratan Tata passed away. But the House of Tatas really was established by Jamshedji Tata. And I like this because my own institution, the Indian Institute of Science, features here. And as far as I know, it's the only Indian institution which has featured in a comic book, in an Amar Chitra Katha. So I have made a slide of it. And this, it tells you the romantic history of the birth of the Indian Institute of Science, which I will tell you a little bit about. The Indian Institute of Science, of course, has been there for a long time before independence. It's still there a long time after independence, and it is still recognized as one of the major centers for teaching and research in India. So one thing that one must understand from the Indian Institute of Science is what has made the institution resilient? How has it survived a turbulent century or more? There are many books which will tell you about Jamshed Tata, but Frank Harris's book of 1925 is still the one which is probably the best, because that's the one in which it was closest to the time after Tata passed away, and it was a very scholarly work. When did Tata begin to think about this? He heard this convocation address by the then British governor of Bombay, who said that it is only by the combined efforts of the wisest men in England, of the wisest men in India, that we can hope to establish in this old home of learning real universities, which will give a fresh impulse to learning, to research, to criticism, which will inspire reverence and impart strength and self-reliance to future generations of our and your countrymen. Tata at that time immediately began to think of the idea of trying to establish a research institution. In 1892, he instituted the Tata Scholarships for people to go and study in England, and in 1896, the proposal for establishing the Indian Institute of Science was in fact placed before the British government at that time. The institute was born on the 27th of May 1909. That birthday is one that I have imposed on the institution when I was the director, because this was the day in which the government at that time issued a vesting order. But the idea for the institute went back as far as the first proposal as 1896. So you might ask, why did it take so long, 13 years or 14 years before the institution was established? This was because it was a three-way collaboration at that time between the House of Tatas, the Government of India, and the Government of Mysore. All three of them had to agree. And originally, when the institution started, there were only two departments. And you can think about this. You're starting an institution just as the 19th century is drawing to a close and the 20th century is about to be born. And the two departments that you've chosen, one is the Department of Chemistry and the other is the Department of Electrotechnology. So if you go back in time, you will see that much of modern science as we know it today developed in the 20th century. Its foundations were laid in the 18th and the 19th centuries. The 20th century itself began with physics and the quantum. It ended with biology and the genome. So there is a 100-year period in which science advanced in a manner in which nobody could have foreseen in 1896. But why chemistry and why electrical technology? This was really vision in operation, because Jamshed Tata's idea was really the long-term industrialization of India. This was industrialization of India even before the nationalist movement had really begun to take hold in India. This was 15 years before King George V came and crowned himself as the Emperor of India in the Grand Darbar in Delhi in 1911. Why chemistry? Why electrical technology? Because if there's two things that is necessary for the industrialization of a country, one of them is chemicals and the other one is power. And this is what Tata had in mind at that time and those who were advising him. A lot of analysis has gone in later years into the Tatars and the university reform in India in that period, and much of it done by an American scholar. But in the many books that are there, you will find Lord Curzon in 1901 had this to say about the proposal to establish the Indian Institute of Science. Because as history would tell us, Curzon landed in India in 1898 at the end of December. The very first thing that even before he had disembarked on the ship and was still on it, Jamshed Tata led a delegation to him and presented him this proposal for the creation of a research institution. Curzon was a man who was very much interested in education. And he said at that time, to start with polytechnics and so on is like presenting a naked man with a top hat when what he wants is a pair of trousers. Curzon, of course, wrote very clearly. He thought very clearly, although you might disagree with many of his ideas. So during the centenary of the Indian Institute of Science, we had the occasion to produce a stamp. the postal department has a very interesting rule. You can no longer put a single person on a stamp, but there's no rule against putting many people on a stamp. So that's how this was circumvented, and many people are pictured there. I leave it to you. This would, of course, be a question for a children's quiz sometime in the future as to who are those people. But I'll tell you some of them because you will recognize some of the others. There's C.V. Raman, of course, who was at the Institute as its director and then started the physics department. There is Satish Dhawan, who's really the architect of the space program. There's G.N. Ramachandran, about whom I will talk a little bit later, because he was the scientist. And there's Homi Bhabha on the top, who was also on the faculty there. He started India's atomic energy program. The ones at the bottom right, of course, you will recognize, and the two on the top right you will not recognize, and those I will leave as a puzzle. The early directors were all English, and Raman was the first Indian director. Raman, of course, came with the aura of the Nobel Prize. He'd already received the Nobel Prize in 1930. He'd announced the Raman effect in 1928, and that was a time when physics was in ferment. The Raman effect, in many ways, was the first major experimental demonstration of the validity of the quantum theory, and therefore Raman received the Nobel Prize rather quickly. Two directors are featured here, Raman and Ghosh. J.C. Ghosh was the man, silently behind the scenes. Raman's directorship was turbulent. Raman was the only director ever removed from the Indian Institute of Science. The council forced him to resign. This is why when I headed the Indian Institute of Science, I used to tell people when they asked me, one thing the director should not do is he should not get the Nobel Prize. It might be removed. J.C. Ghosh came after Raman. He stabilized the institution. He expanded the number of departments. And the period in which he did this, 1937 to 1948 or so, was a very important period. That was the period when engineers were needed, when technology was growing, and he created all the engineering departments of the institute. J.C. Ghosh was also the person who went on to set up the first IIT at Kharagpur when Nehru began the IITs. These are some of the people who have come out of the institution. So what educational institutions really do, and this is why you need them, they produce the people who are now going to transform their surroundings. And here are just a sample of them. This is an extremely prejudiced list so that I can put them all over here. But you will recognize many of them. Harish Chandra was one of the most distinguished Indian mathematicians. He went away to this Advanced Study Institute in Princeton. After Ramanujam, Harish Chandra had maybe one of the highest reputations in mathematics. But let's go back. The scientists who sprang out of nowhere in Kolkata, there were two, Jagdish Chandra Bose and Prafulla Chandra Ray. Bose began with work in Presidency College, which we would now call physics, and towards the end he worked in the subject which we today would call plant physiology. He truly went across the disciplines. And it is sort of interesting that the first definitive biography of Bose was written by a Scottish polymath, Patrick Geddes, and that's a book worth reading. Here it is, a Westerner coming to India, writing a book about J.C. Bose in 1920. His work on radio waves, microwaves is well known. Communication, a lot of it Bose anticipated. He got the credit very much later, sometimes long after he'd passed away. Prafulla Chandra Ray was the father of chemistry in India. He was steeped in tradition. He looked back at chemistry. His book was called The History of Hindu Chemistry, but it is a modern book. And he is the father of the chemical industry because he set up the Bengal chemicals and factories in Kolkata, because you need chemicals. Many of you may not recognize this, but chemistry permeates everything that you see. And I was trained as a chemist, and chemistry is not a subject which is appreciated by the public. But I would tell you one thing. Some years ago, the Bombay High Court had a very interesting judgment. They ruled in a sales tax case, GST was not there then, they ruled that steam is not a chemical. This was because an industry in Bombay was producing steam. It was heating up water with cooling, and that water was getting hot, and it was piping the steam into the next plot of land, and they were using it now to heat whatever they were doing. So they were selling steam. Government, of course, has different levels of sales tax, or used to have, on chemicals and non-chemicals. So there was a sales tax case which went on. And in a true tribute to the Indian judiciary, that case took 20 years to adjudicate. And at the end of it, they came up with this magnificent solution that steam is not a chemical, so the government must get more money, there must be the higher rate of sales tax imposed. The Royal Society of Chemistry then offered a prize of £1 million to anybody who will produce a material which is not a chemical. They still have that £1 million. And I would urge all of you, whatever be your field, to ask yourself the question, is there anything that you see around you which is not a chemical? And it turns out that even if you go back to old school periodic table, you will find that there's nothing in the world which is not a chemical, not the sand around you, not the plants around you, not you yourself. So chemistry is important. Tata realized this, Prafulla Chandra Ray realized this. Every drug that you eat is a chemical. There are two quotations here which I searched for. And today, of course, you can find things on the internet. You're not very sure that they're true, and therefore you must find the origin. But sometimes the quotations are nice. They're the kind of thing that you would like to say, but it would be much nicer if you could attribute them to someone who's long gone. And Bose had this to say. He says, science and national consciousness. He says, they would be our worst enemy who would wish us to live only on the glories of the past and die off from the face of the earth in sheer passivity. By continuous achievement alone, we can justify our great ancestry. We do not honor our ancestors by the false claim that they are omniscient and had nothing more to learn. This, in fact, is one of the problems that we have always confronted, because we believe that we have learned everything that is. We are not the explorers. We did not make the ships which crossed the seas, even though we were a far greater civilization than the Westerners. We did not explore. We did not think there were anything to be found beyond what we knew. This has been a problem. Bose recognized this very well. More recently, if you read the book by Yuval Harari, the Israeli historian, whose knowledge of biology and evolution is extraordinary, he actually says this. And he says that the ancient civilizations of India and China really fell behind because they always felt that they knew everything and they had nothing to learn. But science is always about learning something, explaining something. We still have a huge amount to learn. Prafulla Chandra Ray said, science can wait, Swaraj cannot. So that you can see that the nationalist movement really influenced him, or I would say, in some ways, he was a part of the nationalist movement. But I must tell you that the Bose quotation is true, because I saw this, put it on, and then I asked a friend of mine in Calcutta to investigate this. And he's tracked it down. This is in a book produced by the Banaras Hindu University. The book is available online, and it was in an address which Bose gave at the Banaras Hindu University. These were the people who started everything, but they don't belong to the period which I'm going to talk about. Neither do the people who are there here, because they did their most famous work really in the period around 1927. Raman, in 1928, he was working on light scattering. And you might ask the question, Why do scientists do what they do? What was Raman's question? Raman's question was a very simple one. He was Raman had already begun to go abroad. All the Indian scientists who had talked about went to England. So they crossed the seas, they saw the seas, and they saw that the sea had different colors in different places. But in the Mediterranean, the sea was rather blue. And the question was, why is that sea that blue color that you see there? Today, if you look, you'll find in many places it doesn't look quite so blue, but that's because of other reasons. Lord Raleigh at that time had a suggestion that it was the reflection of the sky in the sea, and that's what you see. This was an unsatisfactory explanation. Then Raman realized that this was because light falling on water was being scattered. What our eye was seeing was the scattered light. And the frequency, there was a difference in frequencies between the incident light and the scattered light. And therefore, we could, in principle, our eyes perceived the blue. That little difference was what Raman found. He called it a very weak fluorescence at that time. This fetched him the Nobel Prize. And you can see that nationalism must have been quite evident in the dress that he's worn for the Nobel ceremony. You can see, I'm sure the nationalist movement derived a great deal of impetus from Raman's Nobel Prize, because this does tell you what people are capable of in the country itself. There's a famous picture of Raman and Gandhi, the steps of the Indian Institute of Science. And this Scientific American appeared in 1930, which shows the American professor R.W. Wood demonstrating the Raman effect. But if you jump ahead to institutions, we still need institutions. I'll just go back for a minute. I'm sorry, I skipped. Two other people I must mention here. They are really the part of the Bengal Renaissance. Meghnad Saha, who put forward in the 1920s his famous ionization equation to explain the stellar spectrum and thermal ionization and so forth. Satyendranath Bose, who's of course famous as the Bose-Einstein statistics. His fame was enhanced by Einstein adding his name. Bose statistics is what it should have been. But Bose was a man who stayed in the background. Bose was a teacher. Bose belonged to what today one would call the typical Bengali intellectual. Laid back, scholarly, not aggressive. Raman was as un-Indian as they come. He was aggressive like the Westerners. Saha, on the other hand, was well involved in the nationalist movement. And Saha, because he was involved in the nationalist movement, Saha, post-independence, played an important role. He played a political role. He was a member of parliament. He didn't get along with Jawaharlal Nehru and many other things. But Saha contributed enormously to building other institutions. Today, of course, in his memory, we have the Saha Institute of Nuclear Physics in Kolkata. But there was a lot of problems around the time India became independent, when atomic energy was being created, on the kind of tussles that one has between physicists. Bhabha on the one hand, Saha on the other. These are stories which will be repeated in future when we have other major programs which come along. But they were all scientists. They contributed enormously to the science which they practiced. And they were, in fact, I would say, the intellectual drivers of Indian science at that time. Post-independence, we have institution builders again. These are the post-independent analogues of Mahendra Lal Sarkar, Jamshed Tata, Madan Mohan Malaviya. Homi Bhabha and Shanti Swarup Patnagar are two examples. One created the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research and the Bhabha Atomic Research Center, which today are two of our major establishments. Bhabha was an extraordinarily talented physicist, but Bhabha in his later years was an extraordinary institution builder, and he built institutions of very high quality. Shanti Swarup Bhatnagar built the entire chain of CSIR labs. They have grown after his time, but he is the one who persuaded the newly formed government of India to make these major investments and create this chain of laboratories. And when you look at this, Baba says, for example, a scientific institution, be it a laboratory or an academy, has to be grown with great care like a tree. Its growth in terms of quality and achievement can only be accelerated to a very limited extent. Today, for example, we are impatient in trying to push institutions to do what they cannot do on unrealistic timescales. Sometimes it leads more to decay of the institution rather than to sustenance of the institution. Bhatnagar says something very interesting. He says, there is one thing against which a scientist will have to guard himself: narrow patriotism. Patriotism has its place, but patriotism has no place in science because science has no nationality. Science can come from anywhere. Discoveries have come from different places. They all have to be incorporated. They all have to be incorporated in taking the discipline forward. We must be open to this. Jingoism has really no place whatsoever in science. The book on the left, published in 2010, has an interesting picture. There you see Vikram Sarabhai. Vikram Sarabhai took over from Homi Bhabha, who passed away suddenly. Sarabhai also was the man under whom the Indian space program was started. But unfortunately, he died young and died suddenly. The result of this was the man who must get the credit for completely nurturing the space program to the level that it is there today is really Satish Dhawan, who was one of my predecessors as the director of the Indian Institute of Science. But Dhawan does not fall into my time range, so I don't mention him. Then there is the Indian Statistical Institute, another great institution started by Mahalanobis, an institution which has produced some of the best statisticians. India has a remarkable international reputation in statistics, and much of it, the credit for it, must be again go to the Kolkata school. But what I'm going to spend a few minutes on before I wrap up is I want to talk about academic scientists. Because when you come to talk to an audience about science and nationalism, you might ask a question: what is nationalism? When is somebody influenced by what happens in the country? One thing you can be sure: anybody who was born between 1920, in that period, 1920, 1925, 1927, they would have been young adults by the time India got independence. They would have grown up feeling all the excitement of what was a new country to be born. It's a little bit like people like me. I'll tell you my age. I was born in 1949. So what did I grow up with? I grew up until I reached adulthood. I reached the age of 18. The only person who inspired us was Jawaharlal Nehru. So we automatically, as children, as students, as adults, imbibe many things from the environment. So we then become sometimes characterized by that hated phrase, Nehruvian. But there is nothing like that. There is a time and a place at which people are influenced. And then they learn, they may transform. But when you're young, you're influenced far more than when you're old. When you're old, it's too late to learn anything. The academic scientists who I picture on the slide did the best academic research that has been done in India post-independence. The reason I use this is because there is only one yardstick by which the general public discusses the merit of a piece of scientific work, and that is whether it has been awarded the Nobel Prize or not. This is the wrong yardstick. And India has received only one Nobel Prize in the sciences for work done in India, that is Raman. Have there been others, we can ask, which are of Nobel quality, which have in fact been discussed by the Nobel Committee? And these are the two pieces of work. The quote at the bottom of Uncertain Provenance says, "History blots out small merit, but fattens big glory." Sometimes you will give Raman credit for things which he did not do. When I was the editor of Current Science, everybody gave credit to Raman for starting the journal, but Raman had nothing to do with it. And there was a wonderful editorial written in the journal on the need for an Indian Academy of Sciences, which was started in 1934 in Bangalore. But Raman did not write the editorial. So all the unknown people who did this have been forgotten. G. N. Ramachandran did his work in the period between 1954 and 1967, and you can see that he was a student of Raman at the Indian Institute of Science, and he was certainly alive to the nationalist movement. He was 25 when India attained its independence. He was a student at the Institute, I think, when the national flag was hoisted for the first time. Shambhunath Dey did most of his work at the Neel Ratan Sarkar Medical College in Kolkata, an institution which you may or may not have heard of, between 1953 and 1959. What did Ramachandran do? Ramachandran first produced the structure that you see on the left. I know you don't understand structures, and those of you who do probably don't like them. But that is the structure of collagen. What is collagen? Collagen is the protein which is the most abundant protein in animal bodies, and we're all animals. Leather comes from collagen. Our skin got a lot of collagen. Our tissues got collagen. We can't be animals without collagen. He did this in the early 1950s in Madras using the kind of X-ray diffraction pattern that you see there. And this was done by a technique called model building, and he had a remarkable collaborator, Gopinath Karta. Two of them produced that. This is what Madras looked like in 1959, 55, and you can see everybody dressed in white, only the professor with a tie on. Ramachandran became a professor at Madras University at the age of 29, and he went there to start the physics department. So in the archives, there's very interesting letters which were written by the then Vice Chancellor of Madras University, Lakshman Swami Madaliyar, who wrote to Raman, then at the Indian Institute of Science, asking Raman, can you move to Madras and set up the physics department? Raman wrote back saying that I'm about to retire, so I can't set up anything, but I have a student and he will set up your physics department. And once Raman had recommended someone, I don't think Lakshman Swami Madaliyar could have said anything, so he took him. He became a professor at the age of 29. And in our universities at that time, there was no research. Why I tell you this is because the universities which were set up in 1857 did not have much research going on in them. Most of the research departments came later. They came technically, if you ask me, the most difficult structure was the collagen structure to deduce from the data. So Ramachandran was right up there. Are proteins important? This is a figure that all of you will see. There's the coronavirus. This is the protein which has done all the damage during the COVID-19 pandemic. It allows the virus to latch onto your cells and allows the nucleic acid to be pushed inside and more viruses to be made. Without this protein, there is no infection. So protein is important. When Ramachandran did this work, his structure was immediately criticized by scientists in England. He then tried to address the criticism by further work and came upon this idea of how to understand the folding of polymer chains, producing what is today called the Ramachandran map. You do not have to know what this means, but just like the Ramachandran effect, this is one of the rare eponymous figures that you will see in the literature of science. How was it done? It was done in the early 1960s with very little by way of computational facilities. And this was the most advanced calculator then available, and a lot of the computations which had to be done were done with Clark's tables, with logarithm tables, which many of the older people might have used when they are young. By 1967, Raman was already a nominee for the Nobel Prize, and you can see that when he conducted a symposium in Madras, you see two figures, Lakshman Swami Mudaliar, the Vice Chancellor of Madras. And here I must digress. If India's educational system has reached this stage, it is because at some time we had the most enlightened vice chancellors we've ever seen. Ashutosh Mukherjee in Calcutta University, who hired Raman as the Palit professor, and Lakshman Swami Mudaliar, who could hire Ramachandran then as the professor of physics, and many other professors who did outstandingly at Madras. The two foreigners featured there are Linus Pauling, arguably the greatest chemist of the 20th century, and Dorothy Hodgkin, probably one of the greatest women scientists of the 20th century. Both of them, of course, were also hugely involved in the international peace movement. Pauling also received the Nobel Peace Prize, and Dorothy Hodgkin was the president of Pugwash. Today, if you look at international literature, you will see that, for example, you will find the Ramachandran plot in the title, and then you will find this. He says, no general biochemistry textbook is complete without a phi-psi map of the alanine dipeptide. Forget the technicalities. This iconic plot is a compact representation of a profound organizing idea, one that ranks among the fundamentals of structural biochemistry. You cannot get higher praise. Ramachandran, and I must say here, I'll come back to one more remark that I will make about Ramachandran, but before that, I will tell you about Shambhunath Day. This is a retrospective. Cholera is truly an Indian discovery. We produced the first major global pandemic of cholera in 1817. Since everybody now knows the meaning of the word pandemic, you can see the amount of noise that this would have created at that time. Many steps toward the discovery of Vibrio cholerae, but eventually it turns out that the Comma bacillus was discovered by the famous German microbiologist Robert Koch when he came first to Alexandria in Egypt and then to Calcutta, where he then microscopically discovered the bacterium which causes cholera. And now, during the COVID-19 pandemic, this review appeared. This review of the 19th century debate over cholera has more than historical significance. In a time of rapidly evolving epidemic zoonotics, the lessons of that earlier debate are as contemporary as the evolving state of the mutating coronavirus that so concerns us today. Today we have forgotten the coronavirus, but one thing is clear. Biology will remind us a decade hence, 2 decades hence, maybe 5 decades hence, but one thing you can be sure, biology has a long memory. How was Shambhunath Dey discovered at the Neel Ratan Sarkar Medical College? He was not discovered by us. In 1986, I saw this article. This article says mapping cholera research. By now, there were methods for tracking the scientific literature, just the way lawyers track old cases using the Shepherd's Index, the same way Eugene Garfield developed what is called the web of science. And in the early days, he was using this to build what he called networks of intellectual thought. And he came upon Shambhunath Day. Once we saw this, when I was editor of Current Science, we produced a special issue trying to highlight Shambhunath Day's work. And this is what Garfield says. He says there are some parallels, and here he talks about an American Nobel laureate, Barbara McClintock, who discovered jumping genes. But she was honored many, many decades after her discovery. One, because she was a woman. The second, because she was extraordinarily secluded and isolated. He says McClintock is prone to seclusion and intellectual isolation, as was Day. But while McClintock was elected to the National Academy of Sciences in the United States, Day was never elected a fellow of any Indian academy and never received any major award. So this was the issue which was produced. They worked at this time when nationalist fervor was at its maximum. And this is an article which appeared now, a commentary by Joshua Lederberg. Joshua Lederberg is probably one of the leading molecular biologists of the 20th century. He was a Nobel Prize winner in his mid-30s, and in his later years became a great commentator of science. And he actually says that Day's clinical observation led him to the bold thought that dehydration was a sufficient cause of the pathology of cholera, that the cholera toxin might kill merely by stimulating the secretion of water into the bowel. What did they observe? They only observed that cholera patients in Kolkata, the diarrhea that they were having, in fact, many of them were placed on stretchers so that whatever was falling out of them would be immediately collected in a bucket below because you cannot clean them. But then when you looked at what was being collected in the bucket below, it was completely like rice water. So he called it rice watery diarrhea. And that means it's mostly water which is being secreted. And therefore, the person is dying now of dehydration. Oral rehydration therapy follows from this understanding. So, this is why today, when we are always asked to hydrate when you have diarrhea, you can go back and see that early observations are very important. But Lederberg, I actually saw a letter in which my friend Arunachalam, who was abroad, saw at the National Library of Medicine. And this was a letter from Lederberg nominating Day for the Nobel Prize. But we could never trace the letter again. I asked Lederberg, when I asked him to write this article, would he mention that? He said no, but instead he wrote this. He said that he is also an exemplar and inspiration for a boldness of challenge to the established wisdom, a style of thought that should be more aggressively taught by example as well as precept. So he had the highest praise for the Cassini, who first found the bacillus, Koch, who really established that it was the bacillus, and Day, who found the cause of the disease. But in 1977, you can see now time. Day had done this work in 1959. In 1977, to one of his colleagues at Oxford, Gay writes this: I retired from service in 1973 at 58, and I'm now running a grocer's shop, namely a clinical diagnostic laboratory at my residence. I have taken it as a hobby which keeps me fit and fairly busy. I have at least this consolation that I'm giving some service to the public, switching over to an applied branch of my broad subject of pathology. Day was invited to a Nobel Symposium in 1978. And in that Nobel Symposium, I will show you what he said. And it says, participants were reminded of how far we have come in a short time by one of the investigators, SND of Calcutta, who in the late 1950s first showed that the symptoms of cholera could be reproduced in laboratory models by cell-free products of the cholera toxin. This is what Day said at the Nobel Symposium in Stockholm in 1978. He says, Chairman and friends, before I conclude, I wish to make a few personal remarks. I have been dead since the early 1960s. I have been exhumed by the Nobel Symposium Committee, and these 2 days with you make me feel that I'm coming to life again. You can't read anything sadder than this. But when Garfield discovered Day's importance, which was 5 years before we managed to produce the special issue, it turns out that he wrote a letter to Day, but Day had died by that time. His two close colleagues in Calcutta, Amitabh Sen and J.K. Sarkar, write that Day could not be informed of this. Ramachandran, whose work is even today in textbooks, I must say, also received not the kind of recognition that he deserved. While he received Nobel nominations, sadly enough, he did not even receive a Padma Shri. And I still remember in my early days, as his colleague, youngest colleague in Bangalore, one day he said, even Hema Malini has received a Padma Shri. What about me? I can only remind you that of Gray's famous lines. He says, let not ambition mock their useful toil, their homely joys and destiny obscure, nor grandeur hear with a disdainful smile the short and simple annals of the poor. Full many a gem of purest ray serene, the dark unfathomed caves of ocean bear. Full many a flower is born to blush unseen, and waste its sweetness of the desert air. Sometimes it turns out that the environment itself has been one which has not been appreciative of many of the things that have been done. But undoubtedly, many of these scientists did what they did only because they were motivated by a desire to do the best that they could in India, an India which was then just developing in the aftermath of independence and trying to take its place in the rest of the world. Today, when we say that we are a Vishwaguru, we will not be a Vishwaguru until we recognize our own gurus who are here and honor them appropriately. Delhi, two universities, Delhi in the 1960s, Kolkata in the 1960s. They are a shadow of what they were. And the 1960s were more than a decade after independence, 1.5 to 2 decades after independence. That picture there shows you T.R. Seshadri in the middle, Panchanan Maheshwari on his left, and K.S. Krishnan, who discovered the Raman effect along with Raman, who was then the director of the National Physical Laboratory, all three of them together over there. All three of them were fellows of the Royal Society. All three of them were highly recognized in their disciplines. Kolkata in the 1960s, this large group, you find Linus Pauling along with Ashima Chatterjee. Ashima Chatterjee one of the most prominent of Indian women scientists. There have been many. In fact, when I was coming to give this lecture just this morning, I was told that uh, the Indian International Center, my host, had got an email from Mrs. Sheila Bajaj, who is a member of the India International Center, who said that I should say something about women scientists, and her mother, Violet Bajaj, was in fact one of the students of biochemistry at the Indian Institute of Science in the 1940s. And I have, at that time when I was director, unearthed a picture of the first 4 women students who were staying in our women's hostel. And we then, students did come to Delhi and interview Mrs. Violet Bajaj many years later, when she, I think, reached the age of 100. So there's a great tribute to many women who have contributed to Indian science. Ashima Chatterjee, when on her centenary, had this Google Doodle also put for her. So in today's age, either go, your tributes must come either on Google or on Twitter, or X as it is called. But when we look at higher education, which is responsible for all of growth of science in colonial India, there are 2 places that you can go to. One is this article which is written in Minerva. And in this article, you will see that the genesis of Curzon's university reform is discussed. And in this book by Durga Das in 1970, he actually makes a case. Here's a rather interesting sentence, one which, of course, would not be liked very much if we are extraordinarily nationalistic in our outlook. He says, what Curzon began, Jawaharlal Nehru completed many years later. What was it that Curzon was trying? He says Curzon was trying to tackle the realities of the problem of Indian universities. And effectively, he was trying to bring governmental control on the Indian universities. And today, of course, governmental control of our universities is almost complete. And the University Grants Commission may, in fact, be a better example for using that marvelous phrase, the caged parrot, which is often used to describe the enforcement directorate and other rather dangerous bodies. Why do I say this or talk about these scientists when you have called me to talk about nationalism? This is because all the people who worked in this period were in fact true nationalists. They did not give up and go away to greener pastures abroad. I've been a bystander for over 50 years looking at Indian science. And all I can say is that I'm reminded of R.K. Lakshman. Nobody draws them the way he did. And finally, there was one man standing there and watching me smiling, and that was the common man. So we've tried to watch Indian science today and its progress in those decades. In concluding, I must acknowledge the 2 institutions which have provided me shelter throughout my professional life, the Indian Institute of Science in the top left, and in my retirement, the National Center for Biological Sciences, which has provided me a shelter. And the greatest and most wonderful thing about both the institutions has been that you could stay there, do whatever you liked, say whatever you like, write whatever you liked, and you were not much worse for it. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Balaram. I think many of the things which you had said today, most of us were not very aware. And I think you brought out the contributions of the many stalwarts who may not got the recognition which is due to them. But I think their sheer contribution will continue, though it may be a past, but I'm sure that in future as well, this work would be appreciated by one and all. So thank you very much, and I hope you would mind some questions or anything.
If I can answer
Yeah. Any questions or comments? Yeah.
Professor Balaram, I would like to know your thoughts on why Indian universities did not do so well as the institutions did. Is it size? Is it that there were too much ideological clashes in the universities? Because the original model was Bombay, Calcutta, and Madras, but that model did not succeed as much as the institutions have succeeded in.
No, I would say it is also because of the changing environment in the country over time. You can ask the question, for example, Ramachandran was the most recognized scientist internationally in the late 1960s. But he left Madras University after he had done his major work and came to the Indian Institute of Science. Uh, that was lucky for me because he gave me a job. But uh, why did he leave Madras University? Everybody would have gone to Madras University because that was around the time that the political situation in India began to change. India began to change. There were lots of aspirations locally of things. And these are natural in a country like India, which is vast, diverse, and has a whole lot of societal problems. Therefore, our institutions are also buffeted by these. And over time, I think the politics of institutions has become enmeshed with politics in general. There is nowhere is it more evident than in the state universities and in some central universities. A central university in a faraway place may not be so much affected, but say a central university in Delhi would very much be affected by events that happen. And we can't do very much about this. I would not argue that the research institutions are doing very much better. It is whether the research institutions are having the kind of impact they should have, given the changes that have taken place in science. But we are also under a handicap. Science moves at a pace which does not worry about how fast the environments move. This is why developing countries will have always a great difficulty in catching up on the kind of science that they do. We have to accept that. But we have to ask questions. Do we have visionary leadership like what Madras University and Kolkata University had at their prime? The answer would really be no. You see, for example, in your own university, Delhi University, if you go back and see what brought it to the level it was recognized, a single individual hiring people, Morris Squire. He hired Panchanan Maheshwari, he hired T.R. Seshadri, he hired the physicists, he hired D.S. Kothari, he hired the people who came and started the Delhi School of Economics. That kind of leadership is needed in educational institutions, and they also need the freedom in which to operate. If they don't have the freedom, then even if they're good, they will not be able to do very much. Today, everybody's hands are tied. And this has, and I wouldn't say it's only now. Everybody's hands have been tied for 25 years or more, 30 years, 40 years.
Professor Balaram, I'm Samrat Ghosh from Indian Institute of Science, Education and Research, Mohali. I would like to know, in continuation with what you said, has the semester system, has the system in recent times? Because I feel the students are hurrying up. They have no time to. They have no time to concentrate on matters to understand. Always the emphasis is on how to get a good grade in a semester examination, and does that contribute to not us not doing well, like our stalwarts had done when we didn't have a semester system?
No, I wouldn't go so far back. Uh, I think we've had this problem now for 40 years at least. I've been a witness to it, so I wouldn't blame the current generation is certainly more impatient, but the problems have been around. They are not new problems which we've had. The decline of the universities has been slow at the beginning and then catalyzed by other events later on. The research institutions are also declining. There is no doubt about it. There is a general decline. The other problem is that we expect educational institutions and research institutions cannot solve all the country's problems. So if you have the expectation from government that they will solve the problems that government has, that's not going to happen. And funding, therefore, and support. See, unfortunately, research and education must still be viewed as a public good, and it must be supported by public funds. And there is a lot of competing factors for public funds. If our economy was booming and there was a lot of money, then maybe everybody would get money. But otherwise, we're also expanded too much.
Sir, you have given like this broad definition of science as a nature. Do you also agree or concur with the definition that science is a predictive mechanism in the process of continual self-correction?
I didn't quite get the question.
Science is a predictor mechanism in the process of continual self-correction.
Self-protection?
Self-correction.
Correction. Science corrects itself. I mean, you can't make too many major mistakes in science without somebody pointing it out. So, unlike scientists are certainly not infallible, and their fallibility is exposed far more frequently than that in other professions. For example, there is this famous quotation from an American Chief Justice, but then quoted by one of our Supreme Court Justices, Krishna, that the Supreme Court is not infallible. It's infallible only because it's final. So even if it gives the wrong judgment, you don't have any other place to go to. This is not the case with science. There's always someone somewhere to correct you and to say that you're wrong.
Thank you.
See, I'm a product of Allahabad University and had the privilege of working on Meghna Sahas furnace. Was a faculty in the physics department of Allahabad University. We were all very much enthused. I'm talking of late 60s. Science was very much there. Research was going on in all the scientific departments. But what we found was that our faculty, they were getting more and more politically inclined with one party or the other. And this started really taking a big toll on the scientific research as well. So, like the civil servants, don't you think there should be some sort of code of conduct that the faculty should not be allowed to align with any political party?
No, I would say this. See, the problem is that faculty are also people, and therefore they will be politically inclined. But it's the question to which your political inclinations determine your actions in academia. You must have a political view, there is no doubt, otherwise you can't vote properly. But, for example, in the United States is more polarized than anywhere else, Republican or Democrat. But when you're hiring someone in a university as a professor, you don't worry about whether they are Republican or Democrat. Or when you're hiring a vice chancellor, you don't do this. So that's the problem.
Sir, you are very categorical in saying that the university system or the higher education in general is facing a deep crisis in the sense that the way they were depending on the state or the public money or funds, now the state as such, is changing. is there any alternative, like the civil society intervening into the higher education system? I think there are private universities emerging, but they are also going in a direction not your stalwarts had the kind of education system basically run by the state, funded by the state. Now, is that system reaching a tether end where the society has to seriously think about how enlightened civil society or informed civil society should emerge as a force, as a corrective force or an alternative possibility? Do you think anything in that direction?
No, I think in India now the number of new private universities which have come, many examples are there, Ashoka, Shivnadar, Kriya near Madras, all of them have been started by what you would call private enterprise, and actually by conglomeration of individuals, not like in the old days by one individual. And I think many of them hold promise, but an institution takes a very long time to evolve. If you look at the Indian Institute of Science, for example, some of the review reports of the Indian Institute of Science before independence, written by Englishmen, were brutal. They were critical, they were unhappy with the progress, everything. Uh, it takes 30, 40, 50 years for an institution to. What has happened is we've allowed institutions to decay. And therefore, for us to build up institutions again is going to take time. And we need to be conscious that we shouldn't allow a good institution to decay now anymore. Good institutions now need to be protected. They are like the cheetah or something. You have to protect them.
Professor Balaram, I'm Professor Majumdar from Delhi University. I have two short questions. One is, I don't know whether it's a segregation of the universities from the institutes that created the problem. As you mentioned about the US, in the US we have mostly the universities. We don't have institutes. Like even the MIT is actually a university. It's not an institute per se, or for that matter, any other Caltech, for example. It's also a university. It's not an institute. But in India, we have the institutes and the universities. And the second thing I wanted to mention is that you did not mention any of the IITs, because those are considered as now the forerunners of the Indian education system, right? And
Yes.
IIT Kanpur in special.
I'll tell you why I didn't consider the IITs, although I'm an alumnus, is that I had put a cutoff date of the early 1960s. I did not want to go beyond that. The IITs were unknown when I went there as a student, and it was very easy to get admission, and I think they were really looking for students. So I must also tell you that when I came back to India in 1973 and applied, I got a letter from a teacher of mine saying that Ramachandran has a position, you better apply. I thought he was in Madras University, and I was ready to go to Madras University because to me that was a fantastic place to go to, and I had not heard of the Indian Institute of Science. That was so I would say that many things have happened in the period where I have been Lakshman's bystander.
Sir, I have a small point.
Professor Balaram, I am Dr. Malti Goel from DST. I want to ask, in your wisdom, it is a question similar to what he said, that before independence, the role of educational institutes and research institutions, I mean, how they played before independence and after independence, up to 67.
See, up to 67, the CSIR labs were in their infancy. I don't think they were a real threat to the universities at any point in time.
In terms of scientific research.
Yeah. Whereas in scientific research, the universities were doing much better. See, for example, I can tell you this in subjects that I know. The Delhi University physics, chemistry, economics departments were much better than botany, zoology. All of them were much, much better than any laboratories, and people would have gone to them. The Indian Institute of Science was not as attractive a place then as it is today. The reason is more not because the institution grew, and I've been there, so I know. And the Indian Institute of Science has benefited more by its stability than anything else. It was sort of an oasis of stability in largely because it was buried in Bangalore. And Bangalore was not known, and it was hidden.
So there was a report in 2012. No, pardon?
Please identify.
Oh, I'm Jayesh Rajput. I taught physics in BHU 68 to 71 and retired as the director of the NCERT. In talking about excellence and quality, in 2012 there was a report of a committee headed by Justice J.S. Verma. It wrote that 10,000 B.Ed colleges are selling degrees. They are not interested in quality. This paragraph has been reproduced in the National Education Policy of 2020, 15.2. Now I make a calculation that if 10,000 colleges are selling degrees and even if 50 of them are purchasing, 50 per college are purchasing, and then I multiply it by 8. So this is the number of teachers that we have not prepared but given them degrees. This is could this not be one of the major factors for the deterioration of quality?
Yeah, I think this is a very valid point. The quality of teaching in universities, colleges has gone down dramatically over the years. Today, most colleges and universities in different parts of the country run only with guest faculty. There are no faculty. And some of them have become just shells of what they were. And a new generation of students is being produced. We see this because I still teach. And now the only thing that I do is to teach students who are coming out after BSc. And when I teach them in the institutions in which they are selected, you find that almost after 12th class or they haven't really learned very much of science, for instance. But that is a deterioration. See, university, there's one word which is used many times in the national education policy, the most recent one. I must say parenthetically that we are very good at policy and documents, but we have great difficulty implementing anything. And in that we have the word autonomous used many times. No institution now is truly autonomous. And even curricula are now becoming standardized. And the teachers are not there. So it's very difficult to keep standards of teaching alive. I can only say we know what the problems are, we have no solution.
So this is Pradeep. This is Pradeep here. So I have listened to your decade back, a complete talk on GNR at IISc or Mohali only. So my question would be on C.V. Raman. Like, did you come across any of his views regarding the nationalistic movement, and why did he choose to keep the knighthood with him, like when Tagore and all returned it?
I think maybe he didn't belong to the award Wapsi Brigade. And no, I think that is a matter of personal choice. And you could ask a different question. Why do many places still call him Sir C.V. Raman? We do that. You can't blame Raman for that. But Raman, I think, was very much a nationalist. But he was a physicist first and foremost. And he taught physics all the time. Yeah. The last.
No.
Hi, thank you for that very enlightening talk. My question is, would it be accurate? Sorry, my name is Shalini. I've been a journalist for 20 years and now I work with a think tank. My question is, would it be accurate to say that India was, say, in the 50s, perhaps the only country or one of the only countries in the global south that had science movements where activism and science, began in states like Kerala and Maharashtra. Um, so, and and sort of looking at the trajectory, I mean, what would be your sort of broad comments on how that movement started in the 50s, and then I think by the 80s it had kind of dwindled away, and how does one look back, and what is it that those uh, different, sort of movements within different states, what did they achieve, where science is working at the grassroots?
See, for example, I can tell you something which I did experience many, many years ago. We have a state council for science and technology in every state. And if you look at the way the state councils of science and technology function, you'll find some states they do very well. Kerala is one of them, Karnataka is one of them, uh, Uttarakhand is one of them. But there are other places where they don't function at all. I would say that the movement to spread science was very much more advanced in Kerala than in any other place. But in the early years after independence, the spreading science was very much connected with trying to remove superstition and to introduce what Nehru famously called the scientific temper. But over the years, it became less productive in other places. That kind of science, where you take science to people, is a movement, I think, even today in some areas like ecology, environment, there are a lot of people who do that and do that very well. That doesn't bring us the kind of technology or things which I think we aspire to. But I think the environmental movement now is still very strong in India in many places.
Thank you very much, Professor Balaram, for this talk and the interaction. I now request Sri President Sri Shyam Saranji.